of Boston traffic and was running to the plane. Managing to get there just as they shut the doors, and I greeted the pilot. He came out of the cockpit, and then I sat down, and we arrived in Chicago, and I had about an hour to spare. So I had dinner at a restaurant across the street, and a lovely couple near me was celebrating an anniversary, and I got to toast them. And then I went to the auditorium just as they were introducing the CEO of the tech company, who was the keynote speaker. Okay, you can open your eyes, and let's see how closely your images matched my experience. In your mental image, was your pilot Black? Was the couple at the restaurant 2 men? Was the tech CEO a woman? So there's no right or wrong to this, of course. You don't have to feel bad if your images were not diverse. Your brain is a fan of what's familiar. Our brains take shortcuts. Imagine every time you encountered a door, you'd have to think, how do I open it? Or at a party, how do you sing happy birthday? This happens in the back of our minds instantly, and we're not even conscious of it. Our brains are efficient, but this also has a downside. They see patterns from a cumulative effect of everything we have been exposed to, and this might make us react to things in ways that are not true to who we are or who we want to be, and we might not even know it. This is bias. Dushel Hockett, founder of Safe Places for the Advancement of Community and Equity, said, "The way we think about, talk about, and act on issues of racial bias and other differences in this country are woefully inadequate and incomplete. There is much evidence from the science community that if we want to move to a radically different and better place in this country, then we have to pay attention to something called implicit bias." So tonight I'm going to focus mainly on implicit bias. Explicit bias refers to our attitudes and beliefs at a conscious level. And you can cut the bias at a conscious level by working on it. But some psychologists estimate that about 80% of our thoughts are automatic, which is why explicit and implicit bias don't always align. Now, most of my examples are going to fall between about 2010 and 2016, and I'll talk a little later about 2016 into the present. I'm just going to share my screen. So, bias. If you have a brain and live in this world, you have bias. What is it? So a bias is basically a preference or prejudice against a certain person or group. And 3 characteristics make it implicit. It operates at the unconscious level. We don't even know we have them. They're not really accessed through introspection. So science says we can't even really answer the question, how are we biased or against whom? They often run contrary to our conscious stated beliefs and values. You can be a school administrator, for example, and really committed to building students up, but you might have a strong percent of suspensions for Black students, let's say. Or you can fully be committed as a police officer to protect and serve.
Oh, okay, sorry. Oh.
But your behavior might indicate otherwise. The science says you can be fully committed to something, but your subconscious is initiating behavior that's very different from what you believe or want. Implicit bias is triggered by rapid and automatic mental associations of stereotypes. Like when I said pilot or couple, you had an automatic image of them. Now, explicit bias refers to those attitudes that are at a conscious level, but implicit bias is much more prevalent. Our minds are cognitive machines, and they encode and store many associations. Implicit bias is a much stronger predictor of day-to-day behavior, and it encompasses both favorable and unfavorable assessments, which are activated involuntarily and without an individual's awareness or intentional control. So unconscious associations, they don't make you racist or sexist. They make you human. Remember, if you have a brain and live in this world, you have bias. However, they can certainly have racist effects. A fairly recent study by Dr. Keith Payne, a professor of psychology and neuroscience, asked white and Black Americans to judge bias, what they thought it was in the 1950s until now. The Black responders thought that anti-Black bias has come down and anti-white bias was pretty minimal the whole time. However, notice the white view. Both thought it was pretty horrible in the 1950s, but the whites see much more decrease. And by 2000, white Americans were saying that anti-white bias was more than anti-Black bias. That's pretty striking. Most white Americans believe that we have done pretty well in overcoming racial bias in this country. Well, those were the perceptions or opinions of the people surveyed. But if we look at more objective statistics, let's say the income gap over that time period,
Pardon?
you can see it's much more or less constant. And these trends are not indicating the downward trend that people thought. In 2013, the average white income was 13 times the average Black income. There's obvious disparity in the job market, yet it is somewhat ambiguous what is causing the disparity of people thinking things are so much better than they are. If the bias has significantly dropped, why haven't the results seen a strong rise in wealth? Now, some people will say there's still rampant discrimination. Others will say Blacks don't work as hard. Some say these are after effects of previous generations, past disadvantages without college and so forth, and that things have changed. But it doesn't really tell us why different people think so differently about it. To have a truly unbiased opinion of what's going on, we need field experiments. So here's a blind study by Diva Pager from 2013, in which a team of researchers went and applied to actual jobs and want ads in the Milwaukee area. The people hiring didn't know they were in a study. Now, half the applicants were white and half the applicants were Black. And they applied for the same jobs. They carried the same qualifications, the same script. The only difference was the color of their skin. 50% of both groups checked convicted of a crime. So as you can see from the graph, about 33% of the whites were called back with no prison record, and about 17 with a record. Now look at the Black callbacks. What is striking about this is that the penalty people pay for just being Black was an even more significant disadvantage than having a criminal record. And remember, white people think bias is greatly diminished, yet these are still the discriminatory hiring practices. So how can both of these things be true? And by the way, that study was replicated in New York and Atlanta and many other cities. Black applicants are getting called back at half the rate of white applicants. One explanation could be that what people say in surveys is not what they're acting on and isn't as prevalent as what happens spontaneously in their minds. So to give an example of that, look at these next pictures. And after you see the pictures, just say what comes to mind to complete the word underneath. So you might not even have known that these are all terriers, but immediately brain associations are made when you see these. What each of these pictures is doing is activating nodes in your brain that instantaneously make multiple connections. So here's another one. And again, when the beginning of the word appears, just say what comes to your mind. So I know you're muted. I'm assuming that a lot of people said terrorist, and saying that doesn't tell me your politics or your values. It just says that you live in the same culture that I do. The interesting and challenging thing about this is that it doesn't matter if you think it's true or not. That association comes to mind involuntarily because our society has linked terrorists to Muslim men. In other words, you don't have to sit and rack your brain for a word associated with those pictures that starts with TER. There are 109 words in my dictionary that start with TER, but our brains automatically attach to the connections that have been made, whether we want them to or not. Now, I think important for our conversation tonight is that these connections come to mind whether you agree or disagree with them. Just having those words and images in your brain will make those connections. That's implicit bias. Our brains make associations. Once those associations come to mind, they change our perceptions, even of sensory evidence. So as lay people, we probably often think of prejudice as bad behavior because sometimes of aberrant personalities even. But prejudice is a side effect of normal cognitive processes rather than aberrant personality. It is usually just categorization, generalization, and association. We have many general biases, and these are probably the most impactful in our society. Think about what you think are most prevalent. Researchers have found actually that age bias is the strongest in our country, followed by obesity bias. Look at the industries focused on helping us look younger and thinner. The fitness craze is not all about good health. Now, a Stanford professor of psychology, Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt, gave results of a young Asian student. When Joy took a math test and was reminded of her gender, her performance actually lowered. Yet when it was mentioned she was Asian, she did better. That's how deeply ingrained these biases are. Simply having knowledge of societal beliefs of a group can influence how we perform. We don't have to endorse those beliefs at all, and they still affect how we act. That's how powerful they are. So we thought we'd take a short break here to discuss if anyone is willing to share an experience maybe of where you recognize a bias, one that you either perpetrated or received. And I think
Jody,
we will unmute. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment.
Jody, I have one to share.
Sure.
Around 2011, my wife and I and my daughter were invited by my employer to a Christmas vacation outside of the country at their place in France. And we accepted. At the airport, everybody was going through screening and all, and I was feeling the way I always feel. And then a family who were Mideasterners came in dressed in their usual cultural attire, with faces covered, men in the men's attire. And I felt anxious. And then when I realized what I was thinking, without any evidence of it, I was ashamed, but I couldn't stop feeling anxious and wondering, was I going to be as safe on the plane?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So would anyone else like to share one? Feel free to unmute yourself. I know Peggy was going to call on people, but I think she's having difficulty as a host.
No, I'm okay now. All is well.
And we are recording, by the way.
Yes.
I'll share something.
Great.
In my early life, I was married to a woman who was a marketing director for Rouse Company, and who was marketing director, the first marketing director for Harbor Place when it opened. And her boss, who at Harbor Place, had a Christmas party that it was 82, and we went to the Christmas party, and the all the invitees except for my wife, my brother-in-law, and me were all Black. And for a moment, only for a moment, but it was enough to share this, is I felt threatened. And but that quickly